About halfway between West Egg and New York, the motor road hastily joins the railroad and follows alongside it for a quarter of a mile so as to shrink away from a certain desolate area of land. This is a valley of ashes, where ashes grow like ridges and where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills, and grotesque gardens where ashes take the form of houses and chimneys and rising smoke, and finally, with transcendent effort, of ash-gray men who move dimly and already crumbling through the powdery air. Occasionally, a line of gray cars crawls along an invisible track, comes to a rest, lets out a ghastly creak, and immediately the ash-gray men with leaden spades swarm up. I know I have this wrong. The ash-gray men with leaden spades swarm up. The ash-gray men swarm up with leaden spades and stir up an impenetrable cloud that screens their obscure operation from your sight. But above the grey land and the spasms of bleak dust that drift endlessly over it, you perceive, after a moment, the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg are blue and gigantic. Their retinas are 1 yard high, and they look out of no face, but instead out of a pair of enormous yellow spectacles which pass over a non-existent nose. Evidently some wild wag of an oculist had set them there to fatten his practice in the borough of Queens, and then sank down himself into eternal blindness, or else forgot about them and moved away. But his eyes, dimmed a little by many paintless days under sun and rain, brood on over the solemn dumping ground. The Valley of Ashes is bounded on one side by a small foul river, and when the drawbridge is up to let the barges through, passengers in the waiting train can stare at the dismal scene for up to half an hour, for as long as half an hour. There is always a halt here of at least a minute, and it is because of this that I first met Tom Buchanan's mistress. The fact that he had one was insisted upon wherever he was known. His acquaintances resented the fact that he turned up in popular cafes with her, and leaving her at a table, sauntered about chatting with whomsoever he knew. Though I was curious to see her, I had no desire to meet her, but I did. I was taking the train up to New York with Tom one afternoon, and as we stopped by the ash heaps, he leapt to his feet. "We're getting off," he said. "I want you to meet my girl." "We're getting off," he said, taking hold of my elbow. "I want you to meet my girl." I suspect he'd tanked up a good bit at luncheon, and his determination to have my company bordered on violence. The supercilious assumption was, on a Sunday afternoon, I had nothing better to do. I followed him over a low, whitewashed railroad fence and back along the road 100 yards or so under Dr. Eckelberg's persistent stare. The only buildings in sight was a small block of yellow brick. Or was it a small square of yellow brick? Small square of yellow brick on the edge of the wasteland, a sort of compact main street ministering to it and contiguous to absolutely nothing. One of the 3 shops it contained was for lease, and another was an all-night restaurant approached by a trail of ashes. And the third was a garage, repairs, George B. Wilson, cars bought and sold, and I followed Tom inside. The interior was unprosperous and bare. The only car in sight was the dust-covered wreck of a Ford that crouched in a dim corner. It occurred to me that this shadow of a garage must be a blind, and that sumptuous and romantic apartments were concealed overhead, when the proprietor himself appeared in the doorway of an office, wiping his hands on a piece of waste. When he saw us, a damp gleam of hope sprang into his light blue eyes. He was handsome. He was a blond, spiritless man, anemic and faintly handsome. When he saw us, a damp gleam of hope sprang into his light blue eyes. "Hello, Wilson, old man," said Tom, slapping him jovially on the shoulder. "How's business?" "I can't complain," said Wilson unconvincingly. "When are you going to sell me that car?" "Next week," said Tom. "I've got my man working on it now. Works pretty slow, don't he?" "No," said Tom coldly. "If you feel that way about it, maybe I better sell it to someone else after all." "I didn't mean it like that," Wilson said hurriedly. "I just meant that." His voice faded off. Tom looked impatiently around the garage. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs, and the thickish figure of a woman appeared in the light from the office door. She was in her middle 30s, faintly stout. She was in her middle 30s and faintly stout. And she's in her middle 30s and faintly handsome and stout. I can't remember anymore. She was in her middle 30s and faintly stout. Her face, above a dress of dark blue spotted crepe de Chine, contained no facet or gleam of beauty, but there was an immediately perceptible vitality about her, as if all the nerves of her body were continually smoldering. She smiled slowly, and walking through her husband as if he were a ghost, shook hands with Tom, looking him flush in the eye. She wet her lips and spoke to her husband, without turning, spoke to her husband in a soft, coarse voice. "Get some chairs, why don't you, so someone can sit down." "Oh, sure," said Wilson, hurrying off in the direction of the office, mingling immediately with the cement color of the walls. A white ashen dust veiled his hair and his dark suit, as it veiled everything in the area, except for his wife, who moved closer to Tom. "I want to see you," he said. "Get on the next train." "All right. We'll meet you on the lower level by the newsstand." She nodded and moved away from Tom just as George Wilson emerged from the office with 2 chairs. We waited for her down the road and out of sight. It was near the 4th of July, and we watched a scrawny gray Italian child setting torpedoes along the tracks, along the road. Terrible place, isn't it? Said Tom, exchanging a frown with Dr. Eckelberg. "Awful. It does her good to get away. Doesn't her husband object? Wilson, he thinks she goes to see her sister in New York. He's so dumb he doesn't know he's alive." And so, Tom Buchanan, his mistress, and I went on Tom Buchanan, his girl, and I took the train together up to New York. We're not quite together. Or rather, not quite together, as Mrs. Wilson sat discreetly in another car. Tom deferred that much to the sensibilities of those East Eggers who may have been on the train. She had changed her dress into a dark-figured muslin, which stretched tight over her rather wide hips as Tom helped her down to the platform in New York. At the newsstand, she bought a copy of the Town Tattle and a moving pictures magazine. And at the station drugstore, she bought a small flask of perfume and some cold cream. In the solemn, echoing drive, she let 4 taxicabs drive away before selecting a new one, gray in color with a lavender interior. And in this we slid out from the masts of the station into the glowing sunshine. But immediately, she turned sharply from the window and tapped on the glass. "I want to get one of those dogs," she said, "for the apartment. They're a nice thing to have, a dog." We backed up to an old gray man who bore an absurd resemblance to John D. Rockefeller. And slung from his neck was a basket of very recent puppies of an indeterminate breed. "What kind are they?" asked Mrs. Wilson as he approached the taxicab window. "All kinds," he said. "What kind do you want, lady?" "I'd like to get one of those police dogs. I don't suppose you got that kind." He peered doubtfully into his basket and plunged in a hand and pulled one up, wriggling by the back, and drew one up, wriggling by the back of the neck. "That's no police dog," said Tom. "It's not a police dog exactly," said the man with disappointment in his voice. "It's more of an Airedale." He ran his hand over the brown wash rag of a back. "Look at that coat. That's some coat. That's a dog that'll never bother you with catching a cold." "I think it's cute," said Mrs. Wilson earnestly. "How much is it?" That dog will cost you $10. The Airedale, surely there was some Airedale mixed up in it somewhere, though its paws were shockingly white, switched hands and settled down in Mrs. Wilson's lap, where she nuzzled the weatherproof coat with rapture. "Is it a boy or a girl?" she asked delicately. "That dog? That's a boy," said the man. "It's a bitch," said Tom. "Here's your money. Go and buy 10 more dogs with it." We drove over to the park, warm and soft. We drove over to Fifth Avenue, warm and soft, almost pastoral, on a summer Sunday afternoon. I wouldn't have been surprised to see a great flock of white sheep turn around the corner. "I've got to leave you here," I said. "Hang on," I said. "I've got to leave you here." "No, you don't," Tom interjected. "Besides, Myrtle will be hurt if you don't at least come up to the apartment." "Come on," said Mrs. Wilson. "I'll telephone my sister. She's said to be quite beautiful by people who ought to know." We cut back over the park to the West Hundreds to 158th Street and pulled up and stopped at one slice in a long white cake of apartment buildings. Throwing a regal homecoming glance around the neighborhood, Mrs. Wilson gathered up the dog and her other purchases and went haughtily in. As we rose in the elevator, "I'm going to have the McKees come up," she announced as we rose in the elevator. "And of course I've got to call up my sister." The apartment was on the top floor. A small living room, a small dining room, a small bedroom, and a kitchen. Fuck. I know it's 4 things. The living room was crowded to the doors with furniture far too large for it. With tapestried furniture far too large for it, so that to move about was to stumble continually over pictures of women swinging in the gardens of Versailles. A picture hung on the wall, one picture hung on the wall that first appeared to be a rooster sitting on a rock, but from further away it resolved itself into the countenance of the rooster resolved itself into a bonnet and the rock into the countenance of an old woman. A reluctant elevator boy was sent out for a box of hay and a saucer of milk, to which he added of his own volition a tin of large hard dog biscuits, one of which sat decomposing apathetically in the milk all afternoon. Meanwhile, Tom produced a bottle of whiskey from a locked cabinet. I've been drunk just twice in my life, and the second time was that afternoon, so everything that happened has a dim, hazy cast over it, even though the apartment was full of bright sunshine until 8 o'clock. I still missed some things. First, there were no cigarettes, and I went to get some from the drugstore on the corner. When I returned, Tom and Myrtle, we called each other by our first names after our first drink. After our first drink, we referred to each other by our first names, had disappeared. So I sat discreetly in the living room and read a chapter of Simon Called Peter. Either the whiskey had distorted things, or it was terrible stuff, because it made no sense to me. When Tom and Miss Wilson reappeared, company commenced appearing at the apartment door. Mr. McKee was a slender feminine man from the apartment below. He had just shaved, for there was a spot of white lather on his cheekbone, and he was most polite in his greetings to everyone in the room. His wife was... oh, I fucked up. Before Mr. McKee. The sister, Catherine, was a slender, worldly girl of about 30, with a solid, sticky bob of red hair and a complexion powdered milky white. The eyebrows had been plucked and drawn on again at a more rakish angle, but the efforts of nature at the restoration of the old alignment gave a blurred air to her face. She jangled as she walked for innumerable pottery bracelets, jangled up and down her arms. Innumerable pottery bracelets jangled up and down her arms as she moved. She came in to the apartment and looked at the furniture with such proprietary haste I wondered if she lived there. When I asked this, however, she repeated the question aloud, laughed immodestly, and said that she lived in an hotel with a girlfriend. Mr. McKee was a slender feminine... Mr. McKee was a slender feminine man from the apartment below. He had just shaved, spot of white lather. His wife was handsome, horrid, shrill. Shrill, horrid, handsome, and horrible. Evil, wicked, mean, and nasty. Yeah, shrill, handsome, horrible, something. He told me he was in the artistic game, and I gathered later that it was he who had taken the over-enlarged photo of Mrs. Wilson's mother that hung on the wall like an ectoplasm. His wife proudly announced that he had photographed her 127 times since they had been married. Mrs. Wilson had changed her dress yet again, and with a change of costume came a change of personality. Gone was the vitality, the smoldering vitality from the garage, replaced with an impressive hauteur. And as she grew larger, the room grew smaller until she was pivoting on a noisy pivot around the smoky air. I love you in that dress, said Miss McKee. Oh, this thing, said Mrs. Wilson. This crazy old thing. She dismissed the compliment. I just put it on when I don't know what to wear. But it looks wonderful on you, if you know what I mean, insisted Mrs. McKee. If Charles could get you in that pose, I think he could really do something with it. We all looked in silence. That's all I got of chapter 2 so far. I gotta get better. I've been falling behind. Anyway.